Welcome to Stand By Please.
With me, Antonia Collins from the Bamboo Manager Project.
And me, Jackie George from Sharjah Performing Arts Academy.
In this podcast, we talk all things stage management. Join us and our guests as we try to answer the question, what is your stage manager really thinking?
Hi, Jackie.
Hello, Antonia. How are you?
I'm all right. Here we are. Oh, I meant to check again what week we're on. I think it's week 30, but I haven't double checked, so I might be incorrect, but I think it might be
I've
week
stopped
30.
counting now.
I know, I've sort of given up now. I'm just thinking, oh, Christmas is coming, isn't it? You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And then it'll be spring and we'll move on from that and that will be absolutely fine. So what are we going to talk about today?
Do you know something I've been thinking about a lot recently? Because we've had a bit more time to think, haven't we, all of us, about how, especially with certain campaigns and union campaigns, about protecting the self and behaviour within the performance environment. I thought we could explore a bit around personal ethics in our workplace. What do you reckon?
I think my ethics, or my awareness of ethics, if you like, maybe, has developed greatly in the last few years, but especially in this year of 2020, where maybe we've questioned things way more than we would have possibly done before. Undoubtedly, we are seeing things through a very different lens from the one we're used to. However, having said that, I remember going for a job interview years ago where somebody asked me, a question at interview was, would I still want the job if it meant maybe working with somebody who I didn't approve of the kind of jokes that they did? It was a comedian, you know, they were talking about. So it's obviously clearly not a new topic. At the time, of course, I said I would get on and be professional and I wouldn't worry about it. But now I would worry about it.
Have you ever stopped working a job or choosing not to take a job because of the ethics, the content, the material?
No, is the honest answer. And I wonder who has. However, I do think now maybe I might. Partly it's about being older, isn't it? You know, when you're younger and you're starting out, or if you're at the beginning of your career, we've all been in that situation where we're like, no, I'm going to take the job because I need the money. One of the things I preach a lot is in my teaching is trust your instincts, trust your gut. Yeah, but definitely sometimes I've taken a job where my gut has been going, no, I don't think that's a good idea. But I've done it because I've needed the money. I think now, however, though, I do feel differently about it. But part of that is about being fairly secure in my own employability, I guess.
And I agree with you. And then I think it's a real shame that the way our industry is structured with regards to employment and pay, that quite often we may feel that we have to move the boundaries of what our own ethics are. And I was thinking the same of my own sort of past, my own career. Has there ever been a time where I felt my ethics have been really compromised? And I don't think there's been times when I've gone home at the end of a day's rehearsal and I've seen a situation that I've regretted not dealing with differently. I think there's been a few of those. And I think you're right. I think with maybe experience, a bit more confidence, I wouldn't be so slow now into calling that out. And I do, you know, everyone says you shouldn't live with regrets, but I do still look back at some of those occasions and say, that was a time when I should have said it, called it, not accepted it.
We've all raked back over things in our heads thinking, oh gosh, have we ever not encouraged that situation that then unfolded, but have we actively discouraged it? And I think that's different. And I suspect the answer is that, like you're saying, I've dealt with things afterwards, I've been, I've scooped them up afterwards to deal with them, because I've got a young performer who's upset because they've been talked to in a certain way by a director or a designer, but I haven't stepped in and stopped it as it was happening. But I do think it's different, because you and I have both worked a lot of our careers at drama schools. And as a staff member at a drama school, I definitely felt empowered to step in. And I did on quite a lot of occasions, and said to a director, I think you and I need a quick conversation out in a corridor. Thanks very much. Whereas professionally, I think sometimes we sort it in our minds by thinking, well, they're adults and they're professionals, so if they've got a problem with it, they can say it.
I understand. I do understand where you're coming from, in that the duty of care is shifted, isn't it? But just thinking about who within a company, because I think there's two different arguments in that. We think about the ethics of content. So there might be a particular play or a particular subject matter of a performance piece that might address some of those ethics. And I'd never want to, depending obviously on how it was dealt with, whether it was dealt with in a educated, informed, sensitive way, I would never want to stop that, because that's what we're about. That's what FIT is about. It's for creating those discussions. But then there's also the ethics of personal behaviour within a company. And I was thinking about who sets that tone? Who sets the tone of the ethics and the tone of personal conduct? Does that come from the stage manager? Does that come from the director? And I think it's a mix.
One of the great things about working for a company like National Theatre Wales, who I've worked for a lot in the last year, is they've got quite a lot of clear policies on things like, bullying and harassment and environmental issues. That's kind of like ethics light, isn't it, in some ways? You know what I mean? But like, they're really clear that you shouldn't be wasting paper, and you should use public transport, and you should try your hardest to be as sustainable in your practice as possible, which personally I really enjoy, because all of those things chime very nicely with my own opinion as well.
We should be taking time out to be considerate, to factor in what people are dealing with. We don't always know what's going on behind the closed door. And I think I would like to hope that I can set the tone for that in the rehearsal room. And if I see somebody behaving in a way that's not acceptable, that I then have the support and the backup to make that call in the rehearsal room or backstage or whatever it may be. But it's a really tricky one, and I think there's a lot that could be done from producers to empower their stage managers. I think that's the next sort of movement I'd like to see in that working relationship between producers and stage managers, is that if they expect so much from their company managers, and that's fine, that's the job, that's what's there to do, then they need to empower them to be the eyes and the ears on the floor. And if that behaviour is going on or that practice is going on, that they can confidently call it out.
And I suspect that has always been the case. The CSM, the company manager, they'll always hear more about things, and either they've heard it because they've seen it directly for themselves, or more likely they've been told, it's arrived at their door. I think what's happened though in recent years is that you get a different reaction when you go to the producer. And I think the producer takes it way more seriously. So I don't think the fact that we know about it has changed. I think the results have changed. But, I was talking to another stage manager about this very topic a few weeks ago, and they were saying they were on a show with a very challenging situation, and they went to the producer, and the producer went, oh, well, never mind. Because the world has changed, companies are much jumpier and are much more likely to take real action on something, for sure, than things that happened years ago. Absolutely. And I agree with you 100%. We shouldn't not be doing challenging work. I think we sometimes get lulled into a false sense of security, though, because we imagine that all of the people we work with and all of our friends have all got the same kind of moral code. So I think we forget sometimes. We imagine that everybody that works in the arts is liberal, open-minded, willing to tackle anything. And then occasionally somebody comes up and whacks you around the face and you're like, oh, whoa, okay. I'd forgotten that you exist, because in my bubble, you don't.
I'm having a good old WhatsApp chat with a really good group of friends of mine who work in the industry in lots of different contexts. And I was sort of sounding them out about, had they ever felt that their ethics were compromised, that their beliefs and the way they wanted to live and behave in their lives was not the way. And generally, sadly, it wasn't to do with content or material. It was to do with the people in the company.
I was reflecting on a moment when I was 18 and I was a dresser on a show. And I was dressing a middle-aged man in his dressing room. And he pushed me up against the wall, tried to force himself on me, and I kneed him and left the dressing room. And I went to the company manager and I didn't dress him again. But so in my head, that was resolved. But I wonder how many other young women he did that to. They were out on tour. Did that company manager then say to the head of wardrobe, right, no more young women in his dressing room? Why are we doing this? Do you know what? I bet they didn't.
Or if you shift that situation, they'd be taken out of the workplace.
Yeah. That's funny, isn't it? I hadn't even thought of that as an option. I think, I think that worries me a bit now, that I've always been like, oh, well, I dealt with that bullying, or I dealt with that sexual harassment or whatever. But I think now more about the long-term impact of that. I worked many years ago. It was my first stage manager job, I think, and on this tour, and the director was a nightmare. He was an absolute nightmare, and he just loved to, and he used to come to every venue. Yay, brilliant. And
one of those.
And he loved to, say scathing things to me in front of everybody else. And I remember I was one week when we must have been in Wimbledon. I was staying with a friend in London, and I was crying, and she was like, no, because I was like, should I leave? And she was like, no, you're going to carry on doing this job, but you've only got like 3 weeks to go. You're going to get through it and you're going to move on, which of course is exactly what happened, because I was young and I needed the job. And we wouldn't let anybody down, would we? Of course we wouldn't, because that would be ridiculous. But he presumably just carried on with that behavior. It wasn't particular to me, was it? I thought it was at the time, but I was just probably a long line of young women, I'm guessing, that he thought it was appropriate to berate and be really nasty to. I worry more about the others. I guess it's been older. I worry more about the others that have come behind now. And I think it is better. It feels like it's a bit better. But how many times have you watched a director pull somebody absolutely to bits?
And at what point is it, oh, well, they're not just giving them a note now, they're actually getting quite personal, and this has become something else? If this person is the top of your bill, if this person is your director, if this person is going to make this show sell tickets, I think the boundaries for their behaviour are much looser than, fourth sound person from the left. Isn't it?
No. You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. Of course it is, and you and I can both think of 100 examples of when that has happened. But it's about visibility. I'm friends with a young ASM. I'm friends with many young ASMs, and she did a job on a big West End show where every day the cast would come off and shout at her because she was the person in the wing. Now, that's not really acceptable. Sorry, from whichever way you look at it. But it was allowed because guess what? Their names are on the poster. Why is it acceptable to have this kind of, very crazy behavior, we don't in real life go and shout at people. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't.
No, I try not to, as a general rule.
Just popped to Tesco's, shouted at the shop assistant, came home. I mean, of course you don't.
I purposefully, years ago, I took a lesson out that quite often used to feature. And I remember having this lesson myself when you try to give student stage managers the context of performers. So you say, you're not the one on stage, you're not the one remembering lines, you're not the one that's vulnerable. And if you haven't set that prop or wherever it is, and they come off and they scream at you, then you just have to bite your tongue and take it. No, actually, you don't. You will absolutely say sorry, say it won't happen again, like you would in a job. You make a mistake, you own it, you move on. But that doesn't make it allowable for people to treat you with disrespect.
And lovely performers will come off stage, shout at you because they're mortified that something's just happened, and then come back 5 minutes later and go, oh God, I'm so sorry. I just lost the plot a moment there.
Yes.
And that's fine. I have no problem with that at all, because I do totally get it. Like you're saying, I totally get it in the heat of the moment. You've been made to look like a fool. And yes. And, an ASM's job, stage manager's job, is in the repetition market. So if you've misset your props that day, that's not really so good, is it? One director did famously shout at me outside the venue and said to me, it's not your name on the poster, over something. And I remember looking at the poster thinking, well, your name's not on it either. But I've tried to defend some of that behaviour with students when I've been talking to them about it. And actually, not being a decent human is fairly indefensible, actually.
I was just thinking about a particular occasion where I saw, after press night, the show had happened. There was mumblings already about what the general consensus was from the audience. And the artistic director was screaming at the director outside very publicly, and we were all like, wow, this is happening. Okay, how do we deal with this? And I hate to admit it, but following that show I went on to do another show for that company. Now, the director was big enough and ugly enough to look after themselves, and it got to a point where he gave as good as he was given. But if I didn't have to factor in, I need to pay my bills, or I want to do the next job, I probably would have said, I'm not going to work for you again, if that's your behaviour.
But also, how many times have you thought, I've thought, oh, well, they're all right with me. So they're not being abusive or bullying or anything with me. And you're like, no, Antonia, you've got to look at the whole. That if they're bullying somebody else in the company, or they're arguing with, or they're destroying somebody else, as a stage manager, as somebody who is in touch with the room, with the best will in the world, the best producer isn't going to be in rehearsals all the time every day because they've got other things they need to be doing, or the best artistic director. So you are their ears and eyes. That's exactly the job you are doing. And I think sometimes that's hard for other people to understand, that actually stage management are the conduit between the senior hierarchy of the production company and the performing company. And I think, creating theatre is difficult, can be difficult. I kind of think it should be difficult in many ways, but not to the personal harm of other people's mental health, which is what we're really talking about, isn't it? More than anything else. Somebody I was talking to asked me whether I thought it was different whether you were a freelancer or whether you worked for a company, how much you felt like you would stand up for your personal ethics and morals. And my instant thought was, I think it's easier to be a freelancer because you don't ever have to work for that company again if you don't want to. But if you're actually working for a company full time, then maybe you can change their attitude from the inside. Maybe there is the ability to make a real change Unlike if you're a freelancer, you're mainly just kind of float. I know we repeatedly work for some people, but you're fundamentally just floating through, aren't you? Do you know what I mean?
If you work in a department, if you work in a building or a company, it can only sort of, if you keep your own desk tidy, then that can only sort of infiltrate through the company, or hopefully that can get washed out.
Going back to the beginning of our chat and thinking about, the difference, do you need a different set of morals between your ethics, morals, whatever we call them, between your personal life and your work life? I don't know whether I could do that. I'm a total open book. Anybody who's friends with me on social media knows that, you can ask me anything, I'll tell you anything, it's absolutely fine. But I was at this conference last weekend and I went to a session that was really fascinating, but it was about the stage managers of the Democratic Convention in America. And a couple of the guys were talking and they said, oh, we don't just work for the Democrats, we also do Republican conventions as well, and we do the Tonys and we do this, that and the other. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know quite how I would feel about that, but then it's all money, isn't it? And it's a job. But I guess for me, my work life and my home life and my social life and my friends is also mushed up together, that I kind of think I've probably only got one moral compass.
But it goes back to creating this safe space, isn't it? And we as a performing arts industry, we talk loudly about creating safe spaces for this challenging work, for these issues to be addressed. And we create this safe space for the content. And I think now, as an industry, we can create safe spaces for the people that work in them as well.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Stand By Please. Come join us next time where we'll be talking with Gareth Hoolens from Q2Q, Antonia and Jackie, Ofcoms.